So our third method for solving a quadratic equation is something called completing the square. And this kind of puts together the factoring and the square rooting all in one. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square. Before we talk about completing the square, we need to know what the square is that we're talking about. And we're talking about perfect square trinomials. So if I asked you to distribute this, hopefully the first thing you would do is you would write it here twice, and then you would double distribute. X times x gives me x squared, x times 4 gives me 4x, and then I got to distribute the 4. So there's another 4x plus 16. And this combines to x squared plus 8x plus 16. Now we call this a perfect square trinomial because it has 3 terms, and it would make a square. If I have a square, this would be like x plus 4 and then another x plus 4. And if I multiply the stuff that runs together, like x times x, that'll give me x squared. X times 4 gives me 4x. Here, x times 4 would give me another 4x, and 4 times 4 gives me 16. And then we could combine it. The reason it makes a square is, go back to elementary school, a square is the same length as it is width. Now something like x plus 4 times x plus 5 would make a rectangle. That's not a perfect square. This side would be longer because it's x plus 5. So if I asked you to factor something like this, chances are you wouldn't think twice about it. You would just ask yourself, okay, I need 2 numbers to add to make 12 and multiply to make 36. But this is special because the 2 numbers that do that are both 6. And when they're the same, remember that's when we would write something like x plus 6 all squared. And the reason we do that is because it would create a square. Now I want you to start thinking about this a different way in the fact that it's a perfect square trinomial rather than doing all of this factoring. And I want you to notice a pattern here. So when you're looking at these terms, this term right here, cut in half and squared, cut in half and squared is always this term there. So let's practice that pattern. The middle term, cut in half and squared, is what this term is here. So if you want to think about it as a square, ask yourself, okay, what would I need to square this out? So the k squared has got to go here, k and k, because that'll give me k squared. Now I need a total of 14 k's, so we have to split that up. Split it up into 2's, and you get 7 and 7. So this will be 7k here, that'll be 7k there, and that makes 14 k's. And then 7 times 7 would give me 49 here. So this n right here would have to be 49 in order for it to be a perfect square trinomial. Now drawing this square out isn't practical at all. So every single time what you're going to do is cut this in half. So here we get -4. You're going to square it, and that's the number that goes up here every single time. The cutting it in half comes from the fact that you need the same amount for your length and width to make it a square. And then, remember, you're going to multiply them together to get the 49. So do the same thing here. Cut it in half. You'll end up with -20. Square it, and we get 400. That is a perfect square trinomial. So the reason we need a perfect square trinomial is we're eventually going to get something like this. X minus 20 all squared equals 400. And then if we think back to square roots, we should know how to solve that, because all we're going to do is take the square root of both sides, and the square and square root will cross each other out. So let's try a problem with some direction. So, skip this for a sec. Let's say I gave you this equation and I told you to solve it. I need to know what x could equal to do this. What we're going to do is we're going to figure out how to change this into a square. So far I have an x squared. I know that has to go there, and this side is x and x. Now this 2 here needs to be split up evenly. So remember, that's when we said cut it in half. So this would have to be 1, and this would have to be 1. So right here I have 1x, and here I have another 1x. That right there, this stuff makes up this equation right here. But the square is not complete. So we have this missing part right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to complete the square. And the number that's going to go there is 1 times 1, which is 1. Now the thing that we're going to do with completing the square is we're going to add that here. This is now a perfect square. And we can't just go adding something to one side of an equation without doing the exact same thing to another. Now remember the reason we do this, because if it's a perfect square, I can factor it. And I can factor it into a perfect square trinomial. So when I factor this thing, 1, 1, I want to find two numbers that add to make 2 and multiply to make 1. And it's 1 and 1. Now remember, we don't write this twice like this. Instead, we're going to write it like this. And it equals the 1. And now we can solve this just like we solved the problems on the cards around the room. So take the square root of both sides. Remember, I introduced a square root, so I have to have plus or minus 1. Remember, that means I have two equations that I need to solve. X plus 1 equals 1, and then x plus 1 equals negative 1. And if I solve this first one I'm going to get 0, and this other one I'm going to get negative 2. So I know that's very confusing, but let's try a problem start to finish without all the words in between. So if you get stuck, always go back to this slide. The procedure for completing the square is to first write the equation in this form. Leave yourself some space because we are going to complete the square. We're going to see what goes in here. And remember, we can't just add one thing to one side. We got to add it to both. Complete the square and add this to both sides of your equation, and then factor it. Take the square root of both sides, and in the step, make sure you take both square roots. So to complete the square, it's always going to be whatever's in the middle cut in half squared. So let's try a problem. So I'm going to rewrite this as m squared minus 6m plus something equals 247 plus that same something. Remember, the goal here is I want to be able to factor this. So I need to come up with a number here that allows me to factor it. And remember, it's always going to be this number cut in half and then squared. So negative 3 squared will give me 9. Now whatever you add to one side, you got to add to the other. And then ask yourself to factor m squared minus 6m plus 9. And then when we add this up, we get 256. So if I factor this, find two numbers that add to make the number in the middle, multiply to make the number on the end, you're going to get negative 3 for both of them. Now remember, we're not going to write it separate, we're going to write it together. M minus 3 all squared equals 256. And now we can solve this. This looks just like problems we did before. We're going to take the square root on both sides, and we'll end up with m minus 3 equals plus or minus 16. And then remember, when we write that plus or minus, that means we have two different problems to solve. Don't just add 3 to both sides and tell me it's plus or minus 9. I need to do m minus 3 equals positive 16, and m minus 3 equals negative 16. So one of my answers is going to be 19, but then my other answer, oh no, we can't write that well. My other answer is going to be negative 13. And remember, just like every other problem we've solved, you can plug this back in. Let's try another one. So remember, the first thing you got to do is rewrite it with some space there. And what we're going to do every single time is take this number right here and cut it in half. So we have 4.5, and then you square it, and you put it back up here. If you take 4.5 and square it, you end up with 20.25. Whatever you do to one side, you got to do to the other. Now I'm going to let you in on a little trick. every single time, once you've made it this far, what goes in your parentheses and is squared is this number that you cut in half. Every single time. If you go back to this number that we cut in half, -3 is right there. You go back to this one, we cut this in half, so we got 1, and that's what made it in this guy right here. So every single time, that number that you cut in half is going to go here. And then it's going to equal whatever 136 plus 20.25 is. And then we solve. So we got to take the square root on both sides. It's totally okay to come up with decimals, but remember we introduced a square root, so it's got to be plus or minus. And you get 12.5. And then split it up into two problems. X plus 4.5 could equal 12.5, or it could equal negative 12.5. If I subtract 4.5 from both sides, this first one I'm going to get 8. And if I subtract negative 4.5, so we're really kind of adding it and making it all negative, you end up with 17. All right, this next one's a little more difficult. If we go back to the steps right here, it said that we need to get it in this form. Now, what's very important is that there is a 1 in front of here. You are not allowed to complete the square if you have a number out front. So to get rid of that number out front, I'm just going to divide everything by 4. And as long as I do it to everything in the equation, I'm not really changing anything, I'm just changing the way it looks. And let's leave ourselves a little space in here so we don't have to write it one more time. And just like we've done, you're going to take this number and cut it in half. So you'll get -1. And then take that number and square it and put it here. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. Now remember, when I factor this stuff right here, I am going to get a plus whatever this number is. And in this case, it's a -1, all squared. And then that's going to equal 7. Now, don't freak out that we're going to get a square root here that we don't know the square root of, because it says round to the nearest hundredth. So if I take the square root of both sides, I get a minus 1, and the square root of 7, we're going to leave for a second, because we want a nice exact answer at the end. But remember, you still need a plus or minus 7. So then to get this by itself, I'm going to add 1 to both sides. And how we're going to write this is a equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 7. Now you can leave it like this, or you can type it into your calculator twice. Type in 1 plus the square root of 7, and you get 3.65. And then type it in your calculator again, 1 minus the square root of 7, and you'd end up with -1.65. Either of these answers is acceptable. Let's try the last one together. So if you noticed, several of the things we've done have had different steps that you have to do in the beginning. For this one, you need to get your numbers, your plain old numbers, on the other side. Where with factoring, you wanted everything on one side. So I'm going to add 15 to both sides here. And I'll get 5n squared. Let's actually change this to 30. Minus 30n equals 25. So make sure you change that to 30. Now remember, you're not allowed to do completing the square if this number is here. So what I have to do is divide everything by 5, and I get n squared minus 6n, n, not m. Leave yourself some space, and it's going to equal 5. So now, just like every other thing I've done, what I'm going to do is cut this in half. I'll get -3, square it, and that's what goes up here. And that's what you add to both sides. And then remember, whatever you get when you factor is always going to be this number here. So it'll be n minus 3 all squared. And it equals 5 plus 9 is 14. So just like the last one we did, it's not a nice pretty number that we're taking the square root of, but that's totally okay. So we'll get n minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 14. And then we'll add 3 to both sides. Let's run out of room up here. So we'll get 3 plus or minus the square root of 14. And like I said, this is a totally acceptable answer, or you could type it into your calculator and then round it to decimal places. So one of your n's would be 6.74, and the other one would be -0.74. So I want you to give this guy a try here. Remember, you're not allowed to have this number here, so that should be your first step, is getting rid of it. Make sure you write down the questions that you have, and we can go over them together in class. Enjoy your night.